Welcome everybody. This is the TEQSA's first quality assurance webinar for 2021. It's a great pleasure to be speaking today and being joined with some eminent panel members to talk about achieving self-accreditation. My name's Nick Saunders. I'm the Chief Commissioner of TEQSA, and today I'm joined by Kevin Petrie and Jane Fernandez to talk about their journey at Avondale to gain self-accrediting authority. But before we get to the business of the meeting, let's first of all allow me to acknowledge country. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country upon which we meet today, and that's scattered throughout Australia, this being a virtual event. And we'd like to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also just like to point out that this event is being recorded. So if you have concerns about that, you can view it on, you can have a look at our privacy policy. But what we'll be doing is recording this event and then putting it up on our website so that others who are unable to be here today can access the material. So let me introduce then Professor Kevin Petrie. Next slide, thanks Tom. The Vice Chancellor of Avondale University College, and also Professor Jane Fernandez, who's at the moment the Provost of Excelsia College, but during earlier times was actually a member of Avondale College and led and guided that college to successfully achieving self-accreditation. And most of the presentation today is going to be from Kevin and Jane as they talk about their journey to achieving self-accreditation. But by way of introduction, I thought I'd just share with you some statistics and observations from TEQSA's perspective about self-accrediting authority. And let me emphasise from the outset that the reason we're wanting to hold this webinar is that we want to encourage people to think about and plan for gaining self-accrediting authority. There are enormous benefits to the institution by doing so, and I hope that those benefits will become evident as we work through the presentation. So first of all, a few statistics. Next slide, please, Tom. So this slide shows statistics about self-accrediting authority for those providers that are outside the university sector. And there's a few simple things to note here. First of all, very few of those providers as a group, there's 140 or so of those sort of providers, only about 10% of them have self-accrediting authority. 4 of those 14, in fact, had self-accrediting authority when TEQSA was formed, and we just inherited those from self-accrediting authority that had been granted by state agencies. You'll see that we've had very few applications for self-accrediting authority. We've only received 13 applications in the 9 years or so of our operation. And you'll see also that of those who applied, the success rate's high. 10 out of those 13 were approved. We only knocked back 1 application, and 2 providers withdrew for reasons which will become evident in a moment. And the other thing I'd point out is that the assessment period is around about 6 months. There are on a few occasions where it's been quite a protracted process, but that's been because TEQSA has been working with those providers to try and get them to up to the mark so that they could be granted self-accrediting authority. So if you go away from this webinar with one message, it is we want to encourage people to strengthen their own internal quality assurance processes, and in doing so, be able to be confident about granting self-accrediting authority to more providers than we do at the moment. If you look at the criteria for self-accrediting authority, I've divided them, those criteria into 2 sections. Next slide. So first of all, amongst the criteria for self-accrediting authority, there are a number of absolute requirements. And unless you can meet these, then there's really no point in seeking to apply, because these really are truly threshold matters that you have to be able to meet before further consideration can be given. So first of all, you mustn't have any unresolved compliance matter with TEQSA or with other bodies like professional accrediting bodies. Now notice that it says no unresolved compliance matters. That doesn't mean that you have to have a perfect record. What it means though is at the time of application you have to have a clean sheet as far as TEQSA is concerned. You've got to have been delivering the courses for which you're seeking self-accrediting authority for at least 5 years. And you have to have at least 3 cohorts of graduates from each of those courses. So you've got to be in the business for some time, and you've got to be able to demonstrate that cohorts of graduates are coming out of your courses. And there has to be at least 1 cycle of review and improvement. And that means that you both have to run your own internal processes in terms of reviewing the courses that you're seeking self-accrediting for. But as well as that, those courses obviously will have gone through a re-accreditation process for TEQSA. So if you can't meet those criteria, then really you've got to do further work, wait further time before you can actually make an application. Next slide, please. We then move to what I would say criteria that requires judgment on behalf of both the provider and for TEQSA. And I've just highlighted a few words in the self-accrediting criteria: sustained and sustainable. Well, those words say that you've got to be able to demonstrate a track record of achievement of the standards, but also sustainable suggests that you've also got to be able to demonstrate that achievement will be continued into the future. You've got to give TEQSA confidence that what you've done to date, your achievements to date, will actually be sustained once you're given self-accrediting authority. Successful delivery, supported by evidence of student success and referenced against national and international comparators. So you've got to be able to demonstrate some benchmarking. You've got to have evidence that the students are graduating and are progressing satisfactorily, excuse me. But notice that it doesn't say you have to be perfect. It doesn't say that you have to have low attrition rates, that you have to have high graduate employment rates. What it says is that you've got to be able to demonstrate success, and that success obviously then needs to be evidenced by comparison, your comparison and our comparison against national and international benchmarks. And then lastly, you've got to be able to demonstrate that there has been successful implementation of improvements that have come out of your own internal quality assurance processes. So let's look and see really what that means in terms of making an application to TEQSA. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide. So when making an application, keeping in mind those criteria that do require some judgment, we would suggest that what you need to be keeping in the back of your mind is that you need to be able to demonstrate academic governance processes that are mature and effective. You've got to be able to show us evidence that you have an internal quality assurance and review process that leads to successful outcomes in terms of improvement. And then lastly, you need to be able to show us some data, be it quilt data or data in terms of student success, that demonstrates that really you are successful in your delivery to the students and in supporting the students as they go through their course. Once again, I know it's been said that getting self-accrediting authority from TEQSA is a very, very difficult process. It's a demanding process. It's an almost impossible process. In fact, what it is that we're not receiving enough applications for self-accrediting process. We're not receiving enough applications from people who have been planning in a staged way to achieve self-accrediting authority over a period of 5 to 7 years before making application. So let's hear now from Kevin Petrie, who's going to introduce Jane Fernandez and hear about the Avondale College story. Over to you, Kevin.
Thank you, Nick. I'll make just a couple of comments introducing our self-accrediting journey before handing over to Jane. For us, our journey towards self-accreditation was part of a longer journey towards that of university college status, which is again part of a longer journey that we're on, and all part of a picture in terms of what we saw as being our mission and purpose. But even apart from that, it just felt like a natural part of our maturing as an institution to be able to move in this direction. For us, the journey did take place over a considerable period of time. One of the criterion that we of course had to address in our application was, demonstrating that history of successful operation, including that those mature internal processes for quality assurance. And I know that is an area that Jane and the team spent substantial time on. For us, as part of our journey, we made the decision to partner with another institution who could provide mentoring and support for us. And we were fortunate to form a collaboration with Charles Sturt University, who was part of our mentoring process and also became an important institution that we're able to benchmark with and to discuss the quality assurance process. I guess it's important to acknowledge every institution that achieves these types of milestones does so with someone at the helm who will dream and drive, mobilise a team, and for us, Jane Fernandez was that person. She remains an adjunct here at Avondale and has had a varied career from that of a high school English teacher, through to lecturing and now senior admin in higher education. Most recently, she's been head of compliance at Study Group and is now Provost at Excelsia. Of course, well known for being the founding convener of HEPP-QN. So, look, thank you, Jane. I appreciate you being willing to share on Avondale's behalf, and we'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Nick. Tom, could we get to the next slide, please? My task today is to share with you Avondale's self-accrediting journey, and I'll try and do that as quickly as I can in the next 15 minutes. I thought I'd start with this slide, which was the media release that TEQSA put out as soon as we achieved, self-accrediting status. And I think this is a good start for those who have the ambitions and the aspirations to become self-accrediting, to take this one slide and actually save that, because you'd see from Nick Saunders's statement there that the mandate from TEQSA is very clear, that you achieve self-accrediting on the back of evidence that we can interpret, implement and sustain our application of the standards. TEQSA also looks for low risk, proven experience, strong governance and our ability to self-govern our courses. And what does that mean? So I'm going to just try and give you just a kind of condensed overview of the steps we took and the journey that we had at Avondale. Next slide, thank you, please. So you'll see in this next slide that I have coined this segment Institutional DNA Framework and Methodology SAA. And I say that because I think that to be self-accrediting, it's one thing to be applying the standards, compliance, regulation, quality assurance. They are critical strands of self-accrediting, but it is also very, very important that we are able to tell our own story and tell it convincingly and own it. And by that I mean our institutional DNA. And that we can then position that story, that narrative, that commitment to higher education with pride and purpose towards enabling and enhancing regulation, compliance, and quality assurance within our institutions. So I call it climbing with a purpose. And this is what we did and achieved at Avondale. I have intentionally used the image of a rolling, malleable ladder to convey how dynamic, agile, resilient, and responsive an institution needs to be to achieve this. Like the nodes and rungs of this rolling ladder, an institution must harness all its forces to stretch, shape, train, sweat, and hold itself in check through this climb to reinvent itself to self-govern. Generationally, we may inherit the genetics and legacies of our institution. That is our unique DNA. Avondale's was its Christian ethos, its service orientation and moral purpose, and that integrity was built into its course profile. And in our application, we showcased how we would position that without compromising regulation, standards, freedom of inquiry, and scholarly development. I've summarized this journey for our purpose through this 7-rung ladder. On rung 1, I just want to reiterate what Nick has been talking about in relation to encouraging the sector to apply for self-accrediting status. It does take courage to step up. And what we need to do to nuance that courage is to first really do a thorough investment in our own institution's purpose, our own institution's commitment to regulation. And so the other side of the coin of that courage is respect. Respect for Australian higher education regulation and the role of TEQSA in assuring Australia's reputation. If we recognize that we are partners in this quest, then our courage can only be in proportion to our respect for regulation and quality assurance. Avondale was uniquely placed in this context because of its century-long history, drawing from its learnings on regulation, compliance, and quality assurance here in Australia, but also across borders, including the United Kingdom and the United States. So in terms of our SAA application, we prioritized our engagement with TEQSA, and picking up again on what Nick said, we were very grateful that TEQSA, Michael Tomlinson and his team actually did encourage us very much to look at how we could profile ourselves for self-accrediting status, and we had very constructive conversations around that. And so those learnings were really that we achieved through our conversations with TEQSA were positive collateral for our journey and for the way in which we actually grew and developed. The second rung of this ladder is what I've called steering the ship. We look at the critical players that we need to steer the self-accrediting authority ship home. Who are the players that we need? We certainly need governors, so the governing bodies, and we need academic leaders, and so my acronym GAL. Governors, executives, and academic leaders play a critical role in steering the ship towards this strategic goal. In this respect, Avondale's success was managed by this coalition, who drafted the SAA blueprint, identifying risks, mitigating strategies, developing talent, appropriating delegations, recruiting expertise, inviting external scrutiny, identifying mentors, commissioning review, and overhauling systems and processes. But all ships must have a charter to steer us, and this is what takes us to rung 3. In round 3, which I've called flipping the method, I just want you to think through what it is that you want to achieve when you step up for self-accrediting. What is it? What is the end goal of that? As with all successful ventures, method is king or queen. So we need a charter and a methodology. In Avondale's case, we flipped that method. And what do I mean by flipping the method? I mean that always in terms of design, delivery, support, and capacity building, which was the 4 domains of the quality management system we built for self-accrediting, we started with where we wanted to finish. That is, keeping always the end goal in sight. So we charted at Avondale the destination points, stressing the point that SAA was a port to home, and home was university college status. Knowing that our goal was beyond self-accrediting, we aimed to achieve an economy of scale by thinking ahead to the greater purpose. To achieve this, we brought all hands on deck. A range of stakeholders cross-sectionally worked around the same table to negotiate how we could change course, and this brought us together to know and own our identity as we aligned ourselves to the critical reference points for a project such as self-accrediting status. And this brings me to round 4 and 5. What did we do to know our institution and to align those points? We observed, we questioned, we learned, and we changed Avondale through a series of change management strategies. We identified through gap analysis and benchmarking our strengths, our weaknesses against our reference points. We were transparent about our gaps, and we mapped 3 sets of reference points: the University College Standards, the Self-Accrediting Standards, and the HES Framework Part A. And we identified the domains that were critical to self-accrediting status, particularly around course review. That mapping was front and center for us throughout. We ran a range of workshops and built a work stream around self-accrediting status. And in this, we reached out to our mentoring partner, Charles Sturt University, to whom we are indebted. We overhauled Avondale's quality management system, and it was a very big project. And so if you look at our quality management system that came through our self-accrediting project and the QMS we had before that, you would see that there was a whole shift in the QMS that supported self-accrediting. And so through that, we then built and redesigned the course review platform, which then brings me to round 5 and 6, aligning our reference points and applying our checks and balances with benchmarks. When we arrived at round 5, which is aligning the points, the reference points, we found that we had positioned ourselves to know and own Avondale on new terms. Change management was critical here, and we had to now onboard not just the leaders, not just the managers, not just the governors, but we had to onboard the whole institution around the strategy of intensifying our governance, our IQA, broadening and deepening the expertise around academic leadership, integrating our committees for the cross flow of information and risk mitigation, seeking efficiencies and effecting restructures, and with assuring capacity building around the new QMS was always in tandem. And I have to say, we spent a great deal of time around the QMS and working and ensuring that that was disseminated right across the institution. The next slide, please. I'm sorry that the slide is not very clear, but that slide actually depicts what our QMS looks like. So the new QMS was built around ISO 9001 Principles of Monitoring and Auditing Protocols, which we named the ++ model. We aligned our work ethic institutionally to Avondale's strategic plan, and we did that so that we could root out all of the distractions. We aligned ourselves through the QMS to the 3 regulatory reference points that was critical to us for self-accrediting status: the threshold standards, the AQF, and the professional standards for nursing and education. We employed what we called a step-up methodology, which we coined the A4I squared. A4 methodology is a discipline that taught us to practice the 4 steps of align, act, assess, and account across 4 domains: course design, course delivery, student support, and capacity building. And the I squared meant improvement and impact. And these were our identified goals, and they had accompanying metrics. So the QMS was really the machinery that enabled us to achieve self-accrediting status. We were very thorough in that. In terms of our reference points, you will see that there's the governance structures are built into the QMS. So we know that we have reporting protocols, that we have oversight, that we ensure that we actually close the loop on all of our risks and risk mitigation, and that we are making sure that these are reported appropriately through our board structures. We also recognize that the entire institution, organization, the culture of the organization needed to actually be in sync. And so we had a model that had intersections. It was an intersecting model, so that we had each of those clusters of the 4 domains being able to reach across to make sure that we were really working with a distributed model of leadership, and also making sure that we were reporting appropriately through the committees. We made sure that we overhauled our policy repository. We made sure that that all of our reporting was evidence-based, so data was critical to us, and we make assure that the data repository was very carefully. There was an architecture around the data repository and the data scoping that we expected that would support our course review. And then, of course, there were the benchmarks, and the benchmarks were commissioned often through the course review process, through the external advisories, and through the ++ model as well. So with the ++ model, we had what we call a small plus and a capital plus. The small plus was for the internal monitoring that would happen on a regular basis. The big plus was for the external audit, the auditing that became part of our DNA. It was what we did. So in other words, we didn't validate what we did ourselves. We actually invited external scrutineers to validate what we said was good. So when we said, well, this is working, this is efficient, this is effective, the question is, how do you know? How do you know? And so we had that. We made sure of that. All right, so moving on to the next slide. Thank you. Please. So can we come to the last slide, please? Sorry, we are running out of time. Yes. So the QMS, required, as I said, that we overhaul our policy, built an evidence-based practice around data sets. We're grateful for the fact that we use CSU, and we also use WSU. Also in relation to benchmarks for course review modeling. We then also tested our model. We improved our student systems. We improved the management of academic integrity, the management of students at risk. And alongside all of these overtures, we systematically documented and built our evidence to meet the requirements of the self-accrediting application. So we started writing the application and taking that through to our governing boards. We also built a curriculum management system, and in that system we had inbuilt peer review, so that we had the different stakeholders within the institution having oversight and having direct input into course review and critique of that. And so, you know, we come to this stepping up and staying up. So it's one thing to actually achieve self-accrediting status. It's another thing to stay up and to sustain that. And so I thought I'd just summarize for you 7 pointers very quickly to say how we really need to focus on staying up. And I think the first point I want to make is this: we need to own TEQSA's role in-house. So that role, that by self-governing, we actually absorb that role and play TEQSA's role. So in-house TEQSA's role. We promote respect for regulation. So bring our house in order around the foundational principles. That reputational kudos for our institutions hangs on this shared trust between regulator and sector, and understanding that what we do for our students through the quality of our courses actually advantages our nation, right? So that's important. Make visible the QMS. So that is, it's not enough to just build a QMS, but actually make it visible, ensure that it is implemented. And so I'd say to those of you who are on this quest, don't cut corners on quality and regulation. Appoint executive level ownership of this in your own institution. Somebody at the top, at the highest levels, must take charge of regulation and risk mitigation on a day-to-day basis. Building a responsive culture, declaring and mitigating risks, and stepping ahead of issues would be my point 4. Point 5, ask this question with the governors of your institution. Have we closed the loop in risk mitigation? And your second question is, if the answer is yes, how do we know? And how would we provide that evidence? So keeping accurate records and assuring reporting protocols are met. And finally, apart from showcasing the machinery of course review, your QMS, embed the internal monitoring and auditing principle. I would say these are the critical steps for sustaining. And my last word on this is we are custodians of the future and the well-being of our graduates, and through them we actually hold the nation's soul. Course governance is critical for not just regulators and for institutions, but for the nation's well-being and the public good. We must produce quality-assured graduates to take up the course of the future, and the spine of that is the quality of our courses and the privilege we have to self-govern those courses. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jane. That's a wonderful story, and I'm sure highlights the planning that needs to go into seeking and achieving the goal of self-accrediting authority. And I think the many points that you made during your presentation really emphasise the need for a plan, for engagement, both with external players, including TEQSA, perhaps a mentoring partner, external experts that can provide you with assistance and guidance, and indeed rigorous analysis of what you're doing, but also internal engagement, so the staff come on board as well. The importance of governance, and academic governance in this case, is so important. Having a hard look and making sure that both your systems and your people support high quality course delivery, design, support of the students and the like. And then lastly, I think having effective reference points with which you can continually revisit to make sure that you are achieving what you know you need to achieve, both in terms of your own internal processes, but as well as that meeting the standards that TEQSA expects. So wonderful story, and I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions coming out of that. So Justine is going to manage the questions. So
our very first question is going to be for Jane. You've mentioned your mentoring relationships with other institutions, particularly CSU. Do you feel such relationships are essential for a successful self-accrediting authority application?
I think that these sort of relationships are helpful. I don't think that they are mandatory or the only way in which you could achieve self-accrediting status. I certainly see it as critical to university college, but not for self-accrediting status, because as long as you have benchmarks and you are applying those benchmarks, yes.
Great, thanks for that, Jane. I might have another one here for you. We've got one just asking, how did you engage students in the process of Avondale's Self-Accrediting Authority application?
I think that probably that's an area that we could have done more in. I think the way in which we did that was particularly in relation to the graduate outcomes, like really talking to graduates about the fact that, you know, what self-accrediting means, you know, what it would mean in relation to Avondale having ownership of the governance arrangements. And we had a student on council, and so that student was the way in which we disseminated information back to the student body. And that's really how we would have done it, rather than that we actually went out and got them involved in the application.
Thanks, Jane. I might actually have one for Nick now. Nick, a question here for you is, if self-accrediting authority is achieved, is the organisation restricted to the AQF levels it currently has courses in, or can the applicant introduce a course at an AQF level not currently used?
So there are two forms of self-accrediting authority. One is what is currently called partial or partial self-accrediting authority, and one is called full self-accrediting authority. So if you have partial self-accrediting authority, and in essence, that would be most people when they first apply to TEQSA would be seeking limited or partial self-accrediting authority. You have self-accrediting authority defined by course level, discipline, and it is likely that if you're, say, delivering courses only at levels 5, 6 and 7, so up to bachelor's qualifications, you would be applying for those levels, and that's what the self-accrediting authority would be granted by TEQSA. So therefore, if you wanted then to introduce new courses in the same discipline at a higher level, you would have to apply to have those courses accredited by TEQSA. If they're in the same discipline and the first cycle of TEQSA accreditation of those courses was positive, it's very likely that your self-accrediting authority would be then extended to involve higher levels. There's an issue around level 10 and research and doctoral students, which is a special consideration. But within the disciplines that you hold limited or partial self-accrediting authority, it's not too hard then to extend that self-accrediting authority into higher levels of the AQF. Starting in a brand new discipline, that requires some, I think, discussion with TEQSA. You would need to be able to demonstrate to us that you've adequately prepared for that you have academic leaders in that in those disciplines, that you obviously have a plan for scholarship in those disciplines. And then I think it would depend upon the extent to which you wanted to develop that new discipline. But limited means limited, but it doesn't mean limited forever. Great,
thanks for that, Nick. I think I've got another one here for you. This one's in relation to non-university providers. Those providers who have achieved self-accrediting authority only had, say, 1 to 3 fields of education. What is TEQSA's advice in relation to non-university providers who deliver in several fields of education? If applying for self-accrediting authority, should they apply only for one field of education first?
Look, I think that depends upon your own assessments of your own internal capacity and your track record with TEQSA. If you've been able to have courses both accredited and re-accredited in a couple of education fields or disciplines, and you've done that successfully, then you would be wise, I think, to seek self-accrediting authority across those disciplines. I mean, TEQSA has in its own powers the ability to say, well, you applied in 3 disciplines, we're confident of your performance in 2, and we'll give you limited self-accrediting authority in those, but you need to come back to us about that 3rd field in a few years' time. So we do have that discretion, so your application won't stand or fail on the basis that you applied for 3 and you were really only sort of given in the first instance at least, positive outcome for 2. You would not fail completely, and indeed I wouldn't see it necessarily as a failure overall. So it's really, I think, it depends upon a whole range of matters, and the specifics of an individual case needs to be talked through with the senior people at TEQSA for you to get a sense of the likely success of covering multiple fields in your first application.
Okay, great. Thanks, Nick. We do have another question here for Jane. For those of us in senior academic positions leading the Self-Accrediting Authority application process, we understand the value of this profoundly, but how did you convey the importance to staff who may be less cognizant of the benefits that you're assured of their absolute buy-in?
Yes, well, it's a very good question and a very challenging problem, I'd say. Look, engaging the disengaged, I think, is a issue or a problem that will be with us always. I think that's an ongoing challenge, and we have that across all spectrums. And so, but I think one of the things that certainly we did at Avondale was to take the message in small, bite-sized, digestible portions to groups where we found that people, and often it used to be on a one-to-one basis, and really sitting with someone down to help them understand the enormous benefits of self-governance and self-accrediting, and also what it actually said for the reputation of the institution, what it actually communicated to the students about the confidence that the regulator and the government had in the institution, and how that flows on to their degrees. And I think it's a step-by-step trying to bring home the importance of this as taking pride in your institution's DNA, as I talked about, as I said earlier. Yes, so that's a slow process, but mixing up the teams, the different strategies that you'd use, and you'd have the very passionate ones mixed in with those who are perhaps less engaged, and setting tasks where people could actually feel that they really did benefit from exercising a particular, achieving a particular outcome through testing one of the, a part of the model, for instance. That would be a way that you would do that. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Jane. While I've got you, I've got another good question for you. Is what did you learn about Avondale during the process that you didn't already know?
Yeah, another very good question. I think, I was part of Avondale for many, many years, 2 decades really, or more. And so in a way it was, the story of Avondale was something that I knew, very, very, very well, was very familiar with its long history, its reach across the world in terms of the spheres of influence that Avondale has. But I think what this did was because it was back to back, because we also had University College in the pipeline, one of the things that I kept looking at, and as I talked about in terms of the efficiency, was to look at how, when we were collating evidence, we were looking at what we would need for University College. And some of the great stories that came and informed the University College application actually started in the self-accrediting project, where we did reach out to the alumni. We reached out to our alumni, and we did get to know the impact that Avondale had on their professions, on their lives. And that project, I think, became a very rich project that enriched Avondale, because those stories flowed back. So I think that was one very, I guess, very positive kind of collateral that, for me personally, I found incredibly inspiring. The other thing I thought was, bringing stakeholders and looking at Avondale through their eyes. These were external stakeholders. And also one workshop that I ran was with past presidents, who then looked at us and was able, because we were doing back-to-back with the University College, just asking them about the trajectory that Avondale had been on, and what they saw in terms of the growth of Avondale. And I think that the beauty of this, a project like this, is that you actually begin to see your institution through new lenses and new eyes, because it's been challenged to really reveal its maturity, its growth, and you can't take it for granted, because now it was evidence-based. And so you find that we brought together some very rich evidence for self-accrediting status around, staff were inspired to reach out and collaborate for projects around scholarship, for instance. So, that scholarly repertoire of evidence actually grew. So that was one very, very important thing. The other was also being able to showcase to the entire institution these pockets of achievements that were hidden, that people who had won awards, the OLT awards, the citations for teaching. These things were then actually came together, and it became more and more a journey of celebration. There were many opportunities to celebrate Avondale's growth, its maturity, and its accruing success. And I think that was very special, this journey.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Jane. I noticed that we're running towards time, so I've got a couple more questions. Let's take a last two. So Nick, this one is for you. To meet the need to have 3 cohorts of graduates from every course, does that mean no new course development for a number of years?
No, but if it's within the same field, TEQSA would have a view. We would take a generous view of that. So somebody who, say, had bachelor's programs in the field of business and management, say, and then who decided they wanted to put in a short course at level 5 or 6 or whatever, we would not hold that against the provider. And of course, you can always start in new fields and not include that in your self-accrediting authority application. So no, it doesn't mean you have to pause on new course development.
Okay, that's great. And this will be the last question for the session, and it is for Nick. So how does TEQSA make a determination on whether a provider seeking self-accrediting authority should have full or partial self-accrediting authority? The distinguishing criteria aren't clear, and even in the proposed provider category standards, the new ones, what would TEQSA be looking for in making this determination?
I think obviously to get self-accrediting authority, the general processes, the strength of your academic governance, the the evidence that you do have a system in place for external reviews that are meaningful and provide you with recommendations that you then have evidence that you've implemented, those sorts of things, they will be a given. In a sense, it'll be the strength of the courses and our own knowledge of you and the courses that you're offering, whether or not we think that there are of equal strength across all the disciplines that you're seeking for. So there is judgment required here, and there certainly is. There is obviously the room for discussion, and at the end of the day, you know, regulation is about making judgments, and so it depends, therefore, on where we finally land. So, Justine, thanks very much for taking the questions and guiding that part of the webinar so well. On behalf of everybody, first of all, I'd like to thank you for participating today, and on your behalf, I'd like to extend particular thanks to Kevin and Jane for sharing Avondale's story with us. I think you've told a wonderful story, Jane, and I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from that. So thank you. The people behind the scenes, well, Justine, you are in front of the camera, so you're not behind the scenes, but Emily and Tom, Karen from the engagement team, and Andrew, our IT person, thank you for the help in putting this together. And let me just close again on the observations that gaining self-accrediting authority brings at least 3 major benefits to the organisation. First of all, it actually strengthens your own internal quality assurance processes. That's a really important thing in terms of your own operation as a higher education provider. Secondly, it brings you enhanced reputation and standing, and that has significance, I think, with the incoming provider category criteria, where there is going to be a differentiation between institutes of higher education and Australian university colleges. And then lastly, dare I say it, there's a financial benefit. 80% of TEQSA's work is done on really related to course accreditation and reaccreditation. With self-accrediting authority, obviously, there's a financial benefit that you've got money that you can invest in your own staff and operations rather than having to pay fees to TEQSA. So can I encourage you all, think about it. It's a journey that takes at least 5 years. Some of you undoubtedly will be on that journey already. Plan it out carefully, seek support, engage with TEQSA, and the best of luck. Thank you.